So you have your green card. Now you are finally ready to get your citizenship and you want to know, what do I need to know, right? What are the requirements? How do I prepare for this? I got you. In this video, I'm going to tell you what the requirements are, what you need to know, what you need to do to prepare for your interview, and how you may be able to skip some of the interview requirements. I am U.S. Immigration Attorney Lillian, and I help my clients get green cards and citizenships for themselves and their families using the U.S. immigration law system. In order for a person to get their U.S. citizenship, the first requirement they have to meet is the time as a green card holder. So you either had your green card for 5 years or 3 years. The 3 years is only for people that are in a marital relationship and have been in a marital relationship with a U.S. citizen 3 years before that filing. So you've had your green card for 3 years and you've been in a marital relationship for 3 years. Then you can file using the 3-year requirement instead of the 5-year requirement. Let's say you've only been married to your spouse for 3 years. However, your spouse has only been a U.S. citizen for 1 year. You would not qualify under this. Okay, the marital union needs to be with a U.S. citizen, and they have to be a citizen for that whole 3 years, not just 1 year. So that is the requirement that you have to meet in order for you to be able to file under the 3-year rule instead of the 5-year rule. Next, you have to meet the physical presence requirement. This means you're physically present in the U.S. for a certain amount of time. So if you're using the 5-year requirement, you have to have 30 months. Okay, 30 months of physical presence in the U.S. in order for you to qualify for citizenship. If you do not have that 30 months, maybe you were outside of the U.S. For way too long, then you have to wait until you meet those requirements. Let's talk about 2 things that green card holders tend to do that make it impossible or extremely difficult for them to get their citizenship when it comes to the physical presence requirement. Remember, as a green card holder, you are a permanent resident of the United States. You are telling the U.S. government that you want the U.S. to be your permanent home. In order to do this, you have to show it through your actions. If you are going to be traveling outside of the U.S., you have to make sure that you limit your time outside of the U.S. So if you're outside of the U.S. for 180 days or more, and you go and apply for citizenship, the officer is going to want to know why you were outside of the U.S. for 180 days or more. So 180 days is roughly 6 months. So if you're outside of the U.S. for roughly 6 months, you may end up having to explain to the officer with documentation. So the officer doesn't just want to hear, oh, well, I just wasn't able to come back in time. I was in the hospital. The officer will want to see documentation that you were actually, in fact, in the hospital. So you need to show your medical records in that time frame past that 6 months. Okay, so the time that you were past that 6 months, the officer wants to understand why you couldn't possibly have come back to the U.S. So it could be that when that happened was, you had an emergency, you had a medical condition, you got into an accident, your parent got really sick, and you could not possibly have come back because you had to care for them. You need documentation for all of that. Okay, in that situation, if you are outside of the U.S. for more than 6 months but less than a year, the officer can still approve your citizenship. They just have to make sure that you have documentation to back up your reason for being outside of the U.S. In addition to showing the officer the reason you are outside of the U.S. for more than 180 days, you also have to show the officer that you maintained your residency in the U.S. And you show this by showing that you had immediate relatives in the U.S., you maintained your job, your home. So if you are renting, you are paying your rent. If you own, you are paying your mortgage, you are filing your tax returns, right? These are things that show that you are maintaining your residence in the U.S. Now, if you are outside of the U.S. for a year or more, you will not be able to meet this 5-year requirement, because once you are outside of the U.S. for a year or more, you cut off your physical presence. That cuts off your physical presence, which means, let's say you've been in the U.S. for 4 years, and then you traveled outside of the U.S., you stayed outside of the U.S. for a year and a half. Guess what? When you come back to the U.S., you have to start all over counting for that 5 years or for the 3 years for you to be able to then get your citizenship. So that's why I tell people, you do not want to be outside of the U.S. for a year or more, because that cuts off your physical presence, and that means you have to start counting all over again. Also, the reason you don't want to stay outside of the U.S. for a year or more is that when you're trying to come back in, the officers at the airport can actually stop you from coming into the U.S. or put you in removal proceedings saying that you abandoned your green card. So you don't want to take that chance. If you are going to be outside of the U.S. for a year or more, make sure that you are applying for a re-entry permit ahead of time. So you have to apply for the re-entry permit while you're physically in the U.S. You cannot apply for a re-entry permit from outside of the U.S. So you have to apply for it before you leave, and that gives you a good 2 years outside of the U.S. Now, that just means you get to keep your green card, but that does not mean that those 2 years that you're outside of the U.S. counts towards the 5 or the 3 years. You'll still have to start over in that counting when you come back to the U.S. The documents you're going to need for your citizenship application is, of course, going to be your green card. Okay, that's the main document, because USCIS wants to know, how long have you had your green card? Let's see it. Let's make sure you still have that. Okay, so that's the first thing you need. Secondly, you need to make sure that you have filed your taxes for every single year that you're required to file a tax return. And if you have children, especially if you are not the custodial parent, make sure that you have documentation showing that you are supporting your child, whether the child is in the U.S. or not. But mostly, if the child is in the U.S., USCIS wants to make sure that you are supporting that child. That goes to good moral character. Okay, you have to show good moral character, that you are a person of good moral character, and that is shown by you taking care of your child. If you have had any criminal records, you want to make sure that you are presenting those documents. They want the certified docket sheet, the certified disposition that says this is what the person is charged with, this is what the conviction was, or the case was dismissed. Whatever the outcome was, they want to see that, and it needs to be certified for them to accept it. If you had probation, they want to make sure that that probation is finished, that you actually finished the probation. If your probation, let's say you filed, you have your interview, and your probation is still a year out before it will finish, you're not getting the citizenship. Okay? You need to finish your probation before the officer will actually approve your citizenship. And by the way, if you are getting value out of this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now that you know that you have your physical presence, you know you have your documentation, let's talk about the most stressful part of the whole citizenship process, which is the interview. This is the part where you go in, the officer asks you civic questions, reading and writing, and ask you a question about your immigration history, and then decides whether to approve your case or not. Most officers will tell you at the beginning of the interview how they're going to structure it. Most officers will start with the civics, then the reading and writing, and then get into your application. You want to make sure that you are studying for the civics. Okay, they have resources where you can get the app on your phone and practice questions. You can download the audio, you can watch the video, you can download the pamphlet where you can read it. So whatever way that you learn, there are resources available to you, and they are all on the uscis.gov website, and also the videos are on YouTube as well. So make sure that you are figuring out the best way that you like to learn, and that you are using the resources available to you to make sure that you are learning what you need to learn. Remember, for the civics, there's 100 questions. So for most people, there's 100 questions, and you need to answer 6 out of 10 correctly. Okay, so at the interview, the officer will ask you up to 10 questions for you to get 6 correct. If you do not get 6 correct, out of those 10, you fail. And the officer can choose to move forward with the reading and writing and the other parts of the interview, or they can choose to end the interview there and have you rescheduled for a second interview. You do get another shot at it, but you don't really want to have a second interview because that's just going to make you even more nervous. So you want to make sure that you get this done once. And for people that are nervous about the reading and writing, let me give you a quick example of what type of questions that I have had officers ask. So one of the questions was, the reading was, who lives in the White House? That was what the client had to read. And the writing was, the president lives in the White House. So if you're able to get that, that is the level that the reading and writing is really on. It's not going to be some, big, encyclopedia words that you need to know, but it's basic reading and writing. If you are not strong in your reading and writing, get into some ESL classes, that's English as a Second Language classes. Most libraries have those classes, or they have resources for you to take those classes. So make sure that you are doing your part now. Now, if you absolutely cannot do the reading and writing, English is just not working for you, let's talk about the exemptions that can lead to you not having to do the interview in English. Or in some situations, you don't even have to take the reading, writing, or the civics at all. So let's talk about that. So the first thing you need to know is, if you are 50 years old and you've had your green card for 20 years plus, you can get an exemption to waive the reading and writing. You still have to do the civics, but you can do the civics in your own language, not English. If you're 55 plus and you've had your green card for 15 years and above, you can do the civics in your language. You don't have to do the reading and writing as well. If you are 65 plus and you've had your green card for 20 years plus, you not only get an exemption from the reading and writing, you also get a shorter amount of questions that you can be asked. So remember, everyone gets 100 questions that they have to study, and the officer gets to pick up to 10 of those questions to ask you. However, if you are 65 years old or older and you've had your green card for 20 years, that number goes from 100 to 20. So if you are in that age group, just know you will not have to do the reading and writing. You can do the civics in your own language, and you only have to study 20 questions instead of 100. The last one is the medical, disability, or impairment exemption. With the medical impairment or disability, you do not have to take the reading, writing, or the civics, and you can do the rest of the interview in your language. So this is a great thing. If you know you have a medical condition that makes it impossible for you to learn the language or for you to comprehend. So people with learning disabilities, people with dementia, people with Alzheimer's, like whatever the impairment is that makes it impossible for you to either pick up the language or learn new information, you must have your doctor that is a medical doctor fill out a form and give that to USCIS, and USCIS officer will review that. Once it's approved, that means you do not have to take any of the tests. You just have to talk to the officer, and you can do that in your own language with an interpreter, and they ask you questions about your immigration history and they can approve you. So those are the 4 exemptions. That is the 50-20, the 55-15, the 65-20, and the medical exemption. Now, those are the exemptions, and once you figure out if you fit into those exemptions, you can go ahead and file whatever form is required, check off the boxes that are required to make sure that the officer knows that you fit into these exemptions. When you get to your interview, the officer will approve the exemption and then conduct the interview based on whatever exemption they approved you of. If you do not have any exemptions, they will just move on with the interview as normal. Once you complete your interview, the officer will tell you whether they are going to approve you or if they need more information from you before they can approve you. Once they make a final decision, you're not going to get an approval notice like you did for your green card. You're going to get an appointment for your swearing-in ceremony. Depending on if you're approved and the office is doing a same-day-old ceremony, you may end up being a citizen the same day that you pass your test. So it really just depends on the office. Don't expect a same-day-old ceremony. Those were common during COVID. Don't expect it, but it still happens. So you may get lucky and end up being a citizen the same day of your interview. If you are wanting to start your citizenship process and you don't know where to start, what information you need, you've had criminal history, you've been outside of the US for more than 6 months, and you're just trying to figure out what do you need to do to make sure that you get your citizenship and it is approved, well, go ahead and schedule a strategy session with me so that I can help you through this entire process and make sure that you qualify for citizenship and that you get your citizenship.